It's January the 1st today, the first day of 2024. On this video I'm going to be exploring, is that the word? I'm going to be exploring the phenomenon of Kenny G, who is the biggest selling jazz artist of all time. Right? Where do we start with Kenny G? He's often portrayed as almost like the Antichrist of jazz. You know, he is often demoted to not even being a jazz musician at all. You know, jazz musicians that do defend him will say, well, it's not really jazz, is it? It's something else. He's making sort of pop music, pop instrumental, saxophone music and all this type of stuff. So often his name will come up as comments on this channel, and it's a sort of joke, you know, that Kenny G is this sort of terrible, you know, force of evil to the world of jazz. This video was promoted by a couple of memes that came up on my Facebook page, which they're quite common, you know, Kenny G jokes will crop up, you know. I think I saw the bit in South Park where Kenny G comes out and plays the sort of brown note and everybody defecates in their pants hearing him. It's a great joke, it's a funny joke. Kenny G has been become the butt, I hate to use that term, he's become the butt of these jokes, hasn't he? He's universally deplored by any self-respecting serious jazz fan. Now, I call myself a self-respecting serious jazz fan. I don't like all that Muzaki jazz, smooth jazz that came out in the late 70s, early 80s. I like the heavy stuff. I like Ornette Coleman. I like John Coltrane. I like the Mahavishnu Orchestra. I like Electric Miles Davis. I want to hear a bit of, you know, in the music, you know. I'm not interested in all this pretty jazz. And Kenny G is the personification. He is the evil king of smooth jazz, isn't he? And so you're probably expecting on this video for me to give him a good old kicking. But I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is explore why jazz musicians hate Kenny G. Because in exploring that, it opens up certain aspects about jazz which I think are in themselves quite deplorable, and I have challenged on this channel. Right, so do you want to sit back? And I'm going to give you my take on Kenny G. Right, so Kenny G, I think, was born in 1954. So he is the same age roughly as Pat Metheny, Val Di Meola, David Sanborn, John Scofield. It's that second generation that come in after the sort of innovators of jazz rock, jazz fusion. He comes from a working class background. He's studied the saxophone. He's drawn not so much to the heavyweights like Charlie Parker and Ornette Coleman. He's drawn to the more popular saxophone players like Grover Washington. Now, these musicians have always been there, right? We could think of master musicians like Stan Getz that play very beautiful, popular music. Stan Getz, with his Jazz Samba album, you know, created one of the biggest selling albums in jazz. We could call this easy listening. You know, we could call Burt Bacharach easy listening, and it is easy to listen to it, but it's sophisticated music. So he starts off as a player emulating other types of jazz musicians, not the Coltrane's, not the Ornette Coleman, not the Archie Shepps. He wants to do something else with music, right? In that respect, he is drawn to the more popular end of music making, which comes out of R&B and soul. His first gig is actually with Barry White. As a very young musician, he is playing that sort of middle-of-the-road soul. From there, he joins Jeff Lorber's fusion group, and this is a seriously heavy Fusac group, you know. And I've always made the division when it comes to Fusak, there's Fusak I love. I love Voyeur by David Sanborn. Right? Now, I sat back and thought, why do I like some of this and don't like other aspects of this music? Well, I'll tell you what it is I am a massive fan of funk. I'm a massive fan of Earth, Wind and Fire, Parliament Funkadelic, James Brown, Slave, Kool and the Gang, KC and the Sunshine Band, Chic. I love all these groups, right? And what happened with Jazz Fusion really sold a lot of records in the early 70s, playing a fusion of jazz with sort of almost like progressive rock. These are the Return to Forevers of the Mavish Noctures. Then disco comes out, the scene changed, and the record companies turn around to jazz artists and say, look, we're going to drop you unless you have a hit record, right? And so a lot of them move across to that, and some of them are very successful. You know, musicians like Grover Washington and David Sanborn are very successful. And they start to open up this area which we could call smooth jazz. Now what this is jazz that is, rather than pulling from progressive rock forms, it's pulling from more straight popular music, disco, soul, all that type of stuff. Now, I think the problem with Fusak is there's many jazz musicians that do not understand the pop elements, and so they make all the wrong decisions, and it's those albums that I find really difficult to listen to. They're just not convincing. I don't think Kenny G's in that bracket. I think one of the problems with Kenny G is we're trying to measure him with a jazz yardstick, which we shouldn't be measuring with him by, and we are not considering a whole other history of jazz that goes right back to Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong was a popular music artist, making popular songs, often with vocals on, that entertained people. He was also a heavyweight as well. He was an incredible player, and he changed the face of jazz. But Louis is like the birth of jazz, and I'm going to be talking about him in relation to Kenny G in a minute. Louis is like the birth of jazz. It embodies both. And so not only do we see the likes of Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young and, you know, Duke Ellington and Count Basie, Charlie Christian, Charlie Parker, all coming out of Louis, but we also see the likes of Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra, right? Of Peggy Lee, that aspect of jazz as well. And this is the thing that kept jazz going. If that was not there, jazz would not exist. All music forms have to be successful, and they have to sell records. If they don't, they die. And I think there's an arrogance and elitism in jazz to look at musicians like Charlie Parker and not understand that market, those tunes he was playing, you know, were based on a commercial market, right? So, you know, Charlie Parker's biggest selling album is Birds with Strings, which has elements, the same elements in there as what Kenny G's doing. Now, the jazz fans won't like to hear that, and I'm not saying that Kenny G's Charlie Parker. What I'm saying, there's an aspect of jazz that exists. This is where we start. There's an aspect of jazz where musicians have been able to create popular music. I think even Miles Davis, when he gets up there, you know, and he makes his name playing, you know, Someday But Mike Prince Will Come in the mid-50s, and he makes his name. This was not creating a small fan base of hardcore jazz aficionados that understood all the atonality and searching exploration of the future of music. This was beautiful music that people could put on to relax to at home. This has always been an aspect of jazz which the elite want to ignore. Right, so the yardstick to measure Kenny G as an innovator, as an avant-garde musician, as a proponent of the language of bebop or free jazz is the wrong yardstick. We have to measure Kenny G on his ability to take the process and techniques, is that the right word? The approach of jazz, and be able to forge something that was far more acceptable and accessible to the normal person in the street. And there's been a whole host of jazz musicians there that have done that. So why pick on Kenny G for doing it? Well, I decided to actually listen to his discography because I've never really listened to Kenny G ever in my life. So I'm going to sort of run down it here. I've got, you know, so his first album is called Kenny G, and it was made in 1982. Okay, when we listen to this, what we hear is very proficient funky jazz which is taking its influence from the popular music, sort of funky dance, R&B influences at the time. Okay, now as I said, a lot of musicians who try and go down that route in the early 80s fail. What I hear when I hear Kenny G on these early albums is he has a very good understanding of the actual generic aspects of R&B and pop music. That they say that aspect sounds more authentic. You know, on the first album, I think he's got J.R. Robinson drumming, who was the drummer on, you know, Off the Wall by Michael Jackson. He's got the right players involved. The grooves sound authentic. Yep, it's not that challenging music, but it's highly competent. We see on the early albums players like Omar Hakim, you know, cropping up. At this time, he would have been seen as a sort of accessible, you know, funky jazz artist, like many other artists. He would not have been receiving the hate at that point. I think around about this point, he starts to get some success, and he's playing jazz festivals. And the critics think he's great. He's getting great reviews playing that. He keeps making albums like this, and in 1986, he makes an album called Duotones. Now, we've got to understand that Arista Records that we signed to, they have signed him specifically to make these sorts of records. What's really interesting is when Kenny G was signed originally, he was told by the record company that they wanted records that would go beyond the jazz audience and be able to reach, you know, that in America, that black audience of kids that are listening to R&B, you know, they're listening to Michael Jackson. They wanted a jazz album that could reach that. And the authenticity of these rhythms and grooves of production, I think, was right. I think he got it right. He got it more right than many other musicians who were trying to do that at the time. There's a contemporary sound to these early albums, which really fits in to the zeitgeist that exists in early 80s pop music. I think he got it right. He was originally trying to, you know, grab that Grover Washington market, and it's quite interesting. On a lot of the artwork on the early albums, he is photographed in negative, so nobody can really tell whether this guy's black or white. You know, they're going for a black audience, and the stuff has a heavier groove to it. These albums have been a success. The critics like it, the fans like it. He's growing in stature, but he at this time is just another musician on the scene, like David Sanborn or, you know, John Clemmer or who else, you know, the GRP stuff, you know, all the stuff I've had to go at on this channel. And 1986, he makes an album called Duotones. This album, as an executive producer, we see the arrival of the incredible Narada Michael Walden, who is also a great friend of this channel. He is my reason why I'm here in terms of drumming. He's my favourite drummer, an incredible musician that played with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. We played with Jeff Beck, played with Weather Report. You know, this is a monster fusion musician, right, that has earned his credentials on that scene. But he himself, as he told me, by the late 70s, the record company could turn around and said, look, have a hit record or get dropped. And Narada's great genius is that he not only had an understanding of contemporary pop music production at the time, but he also had a more profound understanding of pop songs and what makes hit records. He starts having hit records himself. He eventually becomes the producer to Aretha Franklin, reasserting her career in the 1980s and then going on to produce Whitney Houston, Mariah Carey, and a whole bunch of, you know, really huge records. You know, dragging a whole host of, you know, 70s jazz fusion musicians. So when you go and look at the sort of Narada Michael Walden produced Whitney Houston or Mariah Carey, you will spot a few legends on those records. Narada understands what a hit record is. It's an incredible skill, and it's very interesting that bringing in Narada starts to create not only music that is produced right and sounds right and is producing all the generic buttons, but it starts to have those hooks. It starts to have that really esoteric and ephemeral aspects of the hit record, the ability to reach that wider audience. This is an incredible talent. Musicians like Elton John, musicians like Michael Jackson, musicians like Prince, they're incredible musicians. They really are incredible musicians. Stevie Wonder, incredible musicians. But they have an even greater talent, an even rarer talent, and that's to be able to reach the people. The magical mix of Narada and Kenny G produces this album Duotones, right? Now, I was watching an interview with Kenny G, and he said that around about this time, he was on a talk show. I don't know which talk show. It could have been Johnny Carson, Dave Letterman. He was on one of those big talk shows, and he was going to play the single off his new album. And the producer comes up and said, "Look, we're running late. You can only play one track." So he makes the big decision to not play the single, what the record company wanted. He went for the track Songbird. Now, Songbird is actually quite a mellow ballad-like, very beautiful, well-produced tune, right? That appearance led to this becoming a huge hit record. It went on for Duotones to selling millions and millions and being perhaps the biggest selling jazz album in history. And it laid a path for Kenny G to become not only the biggest selling jazz musician in history, but one of the biggest selling musicians in history, with sales that rivaled those of a Michael Jackson or a Prince. You know, in the, what has he sold? 75 million records. It's an incredible amount. I've got some notes here. So Duotones, this came out September 1986. Songbird was the big hit record off that. It reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. And then he brought out another single, Don't Make Me Wait for Love, with Lenny Williams on vocals. That went to number 50 in the Hot 100. He then starts working with people like Patti LaBelle. He's working with George Benson. He's working with Aretha Franklin. He has another hit single, Love Power, which is a Dionne Warwick duet with Jeff Osborne, and he's a guest saxophone player on that. So this is a jazz musician that's just going in the mainstream charts. And this just carries on. If we take an album like his 6th studio album, Breathless, which was released in 1992, this becomes the best-selling instrumental album ever, with over 15 million copies sold worldwide, right? And it sold 12 million units in the US alone. Then he brings out an album called Miracles, which is like his sort of holiday album, his first sort of Christmas album. And this sells 13 million copies. This is insane for a pop artist, but this guy has done it with his saxophone, making instrumental music, right? The thing that sets him apart from a David Sanborn or a sort of Dave Grusin or anybody else that was making very similar music at that time is he's selling millions, right? Kenny G's talent is the ability to do that, right? And of course, if you could do that, you are making accessible popularist music, right? And it is at this time when the backlash against him starts. Now, the main guy that we can sort of blame for this is Pat Metheny. Pat Metheny comes out in the mid-80s and he says something like, the trouble with people like Kenny G is that when people think of jazz, they think of his music and not Ornette Coleman. Yeah, of course they do. Because he's a massive selling artist. Right? That is no proof that his music is bad, but Pat Metheny has gone on to say other things about Kenny G, and I'm going to quote him now. Right? So, this is what Pat Metheny said about Kenny G. Right? Pat Metheny said that he was not really an advanced player, even among pop-orientated saxophone players at the time. So that's comparing him with, say, someone like David Sanborn. And according to Pat, he had major rhythmic problems, and his harmonic and melodic vocabulary was extremely limited, mostly to pentatonic-based and blues-based lick-derived patterns. This for me, and I love Pat Metheny, but this for me really, it really sort of shines a light on a certain aspect of jazz that I find pretty contemptible, really. At this time, Pat Metheny, who has made some incredibly out there music with Ornette Coleman and Derek Bailey, but Pat at this time was also selling a lot of records, making stuff that was pretty easy listening, very beautiful pop tunes. He is also able to write a tune. Now, what Pat's arguing here is that because the harmonic language of Pat Metheny's music is more complex, more detailed, more advanced, that in some way makes his music on a different level to what Kenny G is doing with his sort of diatonic, pentatonic based improvisations. Okay, well, this is just obviously not the case, because in doing that we also would have to knock out B.B. King, Freddie King, all the blues players, all the sort of soul players. There's a whole bunch of legendary musicians that use that language. Now, the reason why people use pentatonics is because people love the sound of pentatonics. A lot of musicians, when they discover the pentatonic scale, it's like a doorway into improvisation, and you have to learn how to make the pentatonic scale work, which is the blues, right? And then musicians get all sophisticated and they don't want to use pentatonic scales anymore. But I really believe that the pentatonic scale it's basically a scale which is halfway between a full, 7-note scale and an arpeggio, and it is a magical mix of notes which are on and notes which aren't quite on, and there's enough there to be able to create a language, which is what blues musicians do, right? I believe that if someone's selling millions of records, it will be that language, harmonic language they're using. All these tritone substitutions and, altered scales that jazz musicians use. These are difficult, for the general public to grasp. So, in a way, for me, Kenny G's ability to create album after album, to create solo after solo, which people absolutely love with that limited harmonic language, shows that his tone, his phrasing, his lyricism must be at a high level in a different way to be able to achieve that, right? With the success of Duotones, the label then changes. Well, I don't think it's the label, but the label would have been happy with the changes that Kenny G makes to his sound. And for me, some of these records, the Christmas albums, the sort of, they're coming out of the tradition of albums that sort of Frank Sinatra started in the 1950s, where you would have a theme. You would have a theme of, say, midnight, or you would have a theme of the summer, of Christmas. These are concept albums in a way, and he starts to do this. And this has been a very important aspect of Kenny G's playing. Now, and the thing is, Oscar Peterson, all these musicians, they made Christmas albums, and those Christmas albums didn't hit you in the face like, Ascension by John Coltrane. It's a certain thing, it's a certain style of music, right? I prefer the early, heavier, sort of funkier albums by Kenny G, to be honest, and I'm not a huge fan of any of his stuff, really, but I think it's unfair to level this vitriolic, nasty criticism against Kenny G. I just do not think he deserves it. I think we should be celebrating that at the one end we have musicians like Derek Bailey in jazz and, Anthony Braxton, and at the other end this wonderful genre is able to produce music that can really reach the masses, because Kenny G does not compromise on what he's doing. He plays the saxophone, he plays the heads, and he plays the solos. Maybe some of those solos are worked out, maybe those licks are taken from somewhere else, maybe all those things are the case, but that's what always jazz has been. Always that has happened in jazz all the way through. Right, so he has had also his supporters in a way. And here we have to go to a musician that I find myself quoting over and over again when we want a reasonable perspective on jazz. I've gone back to this guy over and over again, and it is, of course, Branford Marsalis. So I'll read out the quote that Branford Marsalis said about Kenny G. He said that he was not going to get involved in the silly war between jazz and smooth jazz. And he called on Kenny G's critics as follows: when all these jazz guys get in a tizzy over Kenny G, they need to leave Kenny alone. He's not stealing jazz. The audience he has wouldn't be caught dead at a real jazz concert or club. It's not like some guy says, you know, I used to listen to Miles Train and Ornette, and then I heard Kenny G, and I never put on another Miles record again. It's a completely different audience. Well, I slightly disagree with Branford here. I don't think it's a different audience. I think we have to accept that the jazz audience is bigger than we think, and that's a good thing. You know, jazz should be able to accommodate at one end musicians like Kenny G, populist musicians that know how to, you know, play a nice tune, to play a nice solo over the top of it, brilliantly produced, well recorded. These aren't incompetent albums, right? Now, I want to finish up with this. I went through his catalogue, okay? And I listened to all the albums. And at some point, I put an album that he made in 2015 on called Brazilian Nights. Now, this is this is in the shadow of Stan Getz. It's a sort of, you know, Latin American jazz, easy listening album. So I'm going through these albums, you know, and I'm tidying my room up at the time and doing some jobs. And I often listen to music. You know, I get asked to listen to a lot of music, and often someone will send me some heavy jazz album, and I put it on, and I'm trying to tidy up and get some business sorted, and it's there, and I know it's great, and I know if I sit down, this would probably be brilliant. But I got things to do, and you know, and I'm a bit stressed, and I can't really take all the that's coming out of this record. So I stick on this album, Brazilian Nights, and it starts up. And it's absolutely beautiful. Yes, it's easily listening. Yes, it's easy listening. Yes, it is. It's. But the string arrangements are beautiful. The playing arrangements are beautiful. The solos by the other guys are heavy. And not Branford, because it's Kenny G, is it? And Kenny G is not on this album doing what Pat Metheny says. He's playing bebop lines, right? Albeit a very similar bebop line over and over again, but there are bebop lines there, right? He's playing through the chord changes. He's using the chord tones. At one point, he plays a phrase, because I started to listen to him, what is he actually doing? And there was one point where he plays a phrase, and at the end of it, he runs through an arpeggio of a tritone substitution of the chord, creating a very beautiful, you know, finishing cadence. And I thought, this guy can do this stuff. Right, but what's more important is his tone, especially on tenor sax, which is a very honky instrument. His tone is absolutely beautiful. The execution is beautiful. Now, that is the intellectual response to this Kenny G album, which I thought was very enjoyable. But the thing was, I was a bit stressed. And as this album went on, I didn't want to switch it off. It's sort of... And this is the emotional aspect of Kenny G. He got me. He got me. This album, go and listen, have a listen to it, Brazilian Nights. It's a perfectly good album. And if you want an album which is jazzy, which has improvisations on, you know, which does all the things that jazz does, but is going to come along and be like a nice warm bath that you can sit down and relax. You know, a bit like a Matisse painting. Oh my God, I've compared Kenny G to Matisse. They're all going to hate me. You know, because Matisse's intention with his paintings was the same thing. You know, you get home and you want to relax. What is wrong with doing this? What is wrong with a musician trying to achieve this? What is wrong with that? And the thing is that if I was to go over to my studio over there and I was going to make, say, a dark, churning, you know, avant-garde free jazz track, I can go and do that. And that's a hard thing to do, but I think I could go and do that. But if somebody said, can you write a piece of music that somebody could come on that will take the worries of that person who's listening to it, but just take them away for a little bit, that's really hard to do. It requires a skill. Kenny G is the master. He is the master at this, right? The criticisms levelled at him are unfair. He's been criticised for doing duets with certain dead jazz musicians. This is a little bit like Natalie Cole did with her dad, Nat King Cole, which in no way got the same criticisms that Kenny G got when he duetted over the What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong. If he was duetting over West End Blues, I might have a problem with that, but he's not. He's playing over a very late stage pop hit, you know, which has almost become owned by the general public, right? He's, in playing over it, is doing something that hip-hop artists have done for years. He's transforming that music in a way. He's transforming it in a very schmaltzy way, right? But he's rearranged the music. He's put a key change in there. He is bringing, with deep respect, I believe, his audience to the absolute genius of Louis Armstrong, because there's an aspect of what Louis Armstrong did which is in Kenny G's approach. I think fundamentally, I believe that Kenny G is, how do I put this? Kenny G is, I don't want to use the word authentic, it's not authentic. He is, there's a conviction, there is a real emotional conviction in what he's trying to achieve musically, and I think he's achieved it. He's done a couple of other albums. There's an album that of original material called New Standards that came out in 2021, and I thought this was this was not an album deserving of hate. I could quite happily listen to that album. You really don't have a problem with him. I think that the criticism is unjustified. So now we move on to why. Why has Kenny G been singled out by the jazz world to be so hated? Right, I'm going to tell you it's very simple. It's what I described earlier on in the video. It's the sales. Right, it's the record sales. Okay? That snobby elitism that exists in jazz, where it is seen as being more worthy than other music forms. That it's like classical music. It's a music form which is highly sophisticated, which deserves respect. You have to respect this form. Respect this form. And then for a musician, especially a white musician, to come along, right, and take that form and sully it by selling millions and millions of records and making lots and lots of money is just not right. Especially a working class musician. Right? Jazz is there now, and it wasn't like this in the old days, but jazz is there now for the elite. You know, this is for people who already have the money. You know, they want to be able to sit in their very big houses with their very, you know, posh, you know, dinner guests, and they want to put on sophisticated music, and they want to flaunt their sophistication, right? And they want to send their very, you know, their very privileged kids off to jazz college, because these guys won't need to go and get a job, because obviously their investments, you know, and the profits from their companies will be able to support their kids in going off to jazz college and doing something very worthy in learning how to play jazz, and then they won't have to go and get a job working 12 hours a day to feed their family. They will be able to go out indulging themselves, doing gigs for like $40, playing in jazz clubs to their friends, which will clap very politely and go, "This is wonderful, I love the way you were quoting from Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane, you're so sophisticated." Right? This is what no one's going to say. It's the difference in jazz. There's two great jazz musicians here, right? That are really at the sort of beginnings of jazz. There's Duke Ellington and there's Louis Armstrong. Duke Ellington is seen as sophisticated. He's seen as the musician that is taking jazz to almost like a classical form of music. He's honourable. He is worthy. He is exploring the aspects of racism in America. He's pointing out how that works. This is the whole story of Duke Ellington. But of course, Duke Ellington came from a highly privileged family. Of course, he experienced racism at that time in America, but he also was somebody who was sent off to college to study, the arts. He turned that down. He was able to then go off and work as a jazz musician, supported by his family. This is somebody that used to go as a child to go and play baseball in Washington, and Theodore Roosevelt, the president of the United States of America, would come down to watch him play. Right? Louis Armstrong is the other guy. Louis Armstrong is born on the streets of New Orleans. He's in a waif's home in his early childhood. Right? He's growing up in a world of honky tonks, brothels, of alcoholism, of violence. He has a desire, an incredible talent for music, but with that he wants to reach the people, right? He has a love of the people. He has the common touch. He's able to take this form of music and play it in a way. And when I absolutely love Louis Armstrong. And when I see him play, when I see him sing, when I see him talk in an interview, I see a deep love emanated from that guy, right? Now, I don't think Kenny G is anywhere near in the same realm as Louis Armstrong. But Louis Armstrong's intention came from the street. Duke's didn't. There's always been that in music. I've always been able to detect that in music, all right? Kenny G, same, come from the same background. He has used music as a vehicle to reach the people he grew up with. He doesn't have those airs and graces, I don't believe, right? And this aspect of him, I don't think anybody has really ever said. I don't think it's been pointed out, right? There is an elitism in jazz, and that corresponds with the sort of virtue signalling, which is like a distraction. Miles Davis is another musician. Miles Davis was desperate to evoke the street, but he wasn't that. He was something else. And with Miles, it's almost like there's two things. I think that early privileged upbringing and then his descent into sort of drug addiction and being a pimp on the streets, both of those things were there. And Miles is that sort of the masculine and the feminine aspects of that are personified in his music at the same time, which makes it profound. I don't think Kenny G's on that level. But these things I'm describing, and believe me as a musician, I have seen the magic combination required to succeed in the contemporary music scene. And that is extreme talent. You need a ton of talent, but you also need some sort of wealth behind you. You cannot take 2 years, 3 years off of your life to develop your art if you're working for 12 hours a day trying to put bread on the table. You need some sort of, I'm not saying you have to be super rich, but you need some sort of financial support, and you need the connections. And a lot of musicians who are successful, it doesn't take long on the internet, on Wikipedia, to do a bit of research and find where those three aspects are, right? Now, this is what I call privilege, right? And there's nothing wrong with it, and it's always going to be the case. It's always going to be an aspect of music. This has always been there. There's a trick that you can play, because you can, by criticising Kenny G, you could offset some of that guilt that these privileged people must have. Imposter syndrome. They must sit there thinking, well, I'm here because I knew this person and because they gave me that break and this, that and that. And this musician I know was amazing, but they had to go and get a job because they didn't have the backing that I'd got. And, this must be an aspect. And I worked in the industry. I've seen it. I've seen it up close. Right? But if you can point to Kenny G, and also if you can take certain cultural aspects of identity, right? You could be a millionaire, privileged, connected person, but if you're disabled, you can say, yeah, but look, I'm disabled. I'm black. I'm gay, right? And these things are things. They are things that hold people back. But for me, knowing how the music industry works, they do not hold you back as much as being poor and having no contacts and being in a place where there's no way of getting your music out there. This is far bigger thing now. I have no problem with that. I am not sort of some communist who believes that we should have equity across the whole thing. But I do believe that I want to hear the music that's made by working class people. I want to hear the music of that as well. I want the whole lot. Now, if we have to stomach Kenny G's want to make a ton of money, to reach a wide audience, to make people happy, right? That's a price to pay. That is there. And the elite might just have to realise and be pointed out by me here and say, no, hang on, you could say that. You could criticise Kenny G because of the position you're in, the elite position you're in. You're able to turn around and use him to make yourselves look more sophisticated, to make yourselves look, more erudite. Right? To maintain your position. Okay? Oh, you didn't think it was going to be this heavy, did you? By the end, it's become heavy. So, I feel I've got to the sort of the emotional climax of this video, which is always important on a YouTube video, to get to that point. Where I've now got the audience divided in front of me. There's all those snobby jazz fans going, well, no, he's just arguing that we shouldn't criticise Kenny G. Why can't we criticise Kenny G? I want to be able to criticise him. He's terrible. It's awful music. It's popularist music. Does nobody realise how unsophisticated he is? He doesn't use, Alton scales. There's no enclosures and the tunes, they're just so, basic. The harmony's basic, and he's oh god, I can see Pat Metheny all getting in a big tiz, as he sits in his big mansion, sitting there. I don't like Kenny G. He doesn't use a strong enough harmonic palette, and so he deserves the hate. He deserves the hate because he's made more money than me. I'm not saying Pat Metheny said that. I've said that for comedy reasons. As you could tell, because that impersonation sounded nothing like Pat Metheny, did it? Pat Metheny's more like that, isn't he? Thing about Kenny G is he's not using a very sophisticated harmonic palette, and I don't find that is makes great music at all. I try and ignore, the B.B. Kings, and I try and ignore Steve Reich, although I actually played with Steve Reich, and that was the really restricted harmonic palette because it was minimalist music. I think it was only 5 notes in that thing, but I'll ignore that bit because that was sophisticated, because Steve Reich was trying to do something avant-garde, and I did that with him. And so I know I've made a lot of sort of very easy listening records, but I am Pat Metheny, and I'm a heavyweight musician because I could do it if I wanted to. It's like, when someone does an abstract painting, I like to know that they could actually do something photorealistic. That makes me feel comfortable, because it's rubbish, nonsense, absolute stupid. Well, how can you argue that, Pat? How can you argue it? Right? How can you be so dogmatic and ideological to believe that great music is down to having a complex harmonic palette when you improvise? And then the statement, I'm a drummer, and the statement when he says he has major rhythmical problems, right? The rhythmical problem thing has always been like, it's like an invisible stick to beat someone with. It's like, they got no groove. I think they got all the chops, haven't they? They can play it all. There's no groove there. Who says? Well, I sort of say they got no groove. But how do you measure this groove thing of which you speak? Well, it's what I think's good, you know. There's you know, certain musicians, they just have a groove, don't they? They have a groove about them. This guy hasn't got a groove about them at all. It's just this is so ephemeral. I have listened to him play. I cannot hear any major rhythmical problems with Kenny G. Kenny G's a pretty good player. I've got to say, my first experience of Kenny G was as a young jazz fan in the 1980s. They had some highlights for the Montreux Jazz Festival. Kenny G came on, he was playing, it was funky, it was pretty fiery actually. He was really playing, he wasn't playing like, you know, Archie Shepp, but he was playing, and there was a drive and a funkiness there. He had a bass player called Vale Johnson, and he did a duet with Vale Johnson. It blew me away. It was jazz, it was exciting, it was in the moment, it was improvised, it was cool. I used to watch that video over and over again. Right, I heard duo tones, I thought it was terrible. I thought it was easy listening jazz, of course I did. You know, it's not my thing. Now I'm old, I can see it's beautifully produced, and it has a magic to it that very few albums at that time had, which is why it sold so much. But that was my initial thing, and I've always had in me this little aspect where I always thought, no, I think Kenny G's better than they're making out. Anyway, I hope there was a bit of comedy there at the end. I think I've now definitely reached the emotional climax that you're after, and I have been talking for nearly an hour about Kenny G. I won't do it again, I do apologise. If you like this video, like. If you want to see more, subscribe. If you want to support me, I have a Patreon down below, and you can become a patron, and there's all sorts of interesting things going on there. It's not just extra content, there's all sorts of interesting. You want to get involved in this music, become a patron. And if you don't, then if you could stick a little bit of money in my PayPal tip jar. I had a few lovely Christmas presents from my patrons and YouTube followers over Christmas, and I got to be honest, I was stressed. I'd spent a lot of money because I am like Kenny G was when he came up. I'm a struggling musician. And I was worried about Christmas, and thanks to you lovely followers with your little bits of £5 here and $10 there, I have been able to get through Christmas. So I thank you for that, and I thank the great spirit of music for providing all this. And Kenny G is one of those guys that is contributing to the great spirit of music in his own way. So let's stop having a go, Kenny. And Kenny G, if you have watched this, I hope you appreciate that I like my avant-garde jazz, but I hope I have been able, if you're watching this, Kenny, can you imagine if Kenny G's watching this? And if you are watching this, Kenny, please come on the channel, because I want to talk about the jazz that's in your music, because I know it's there. Okay, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.